Dee Alford is coming off a bounce back 25, which likely means he'll be back in Atlanta in 2026, but we'll make the case either way. Pass or pay Dee Alford.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Locked On Falcons, which is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, now the number one sports podcast in all of America. And I am your humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. the iron that sharpens the iron. I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong here on this Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. And on today's daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, we are doing another stay or go episode, but we love alliteration here on the podcast, so we prefer now pass or pay when it comes to talking about various Falcons free agents that are impending and whether or not the team should keep them or let them go. And today we're talking all about Dee Alford and why the case for paying Dee Alford is you shouldn't let your best nickel cornerback go. And the case for passing him is just because he's your best doesn't mean you can't get better. But that being said, up front, I do expect the Falcons to pay Dee Alford, meaning that I think he'll be back in 2026. And part of that is owed to Billy Bowman, right? And today's episode is not going to be about Billy Bowman, but I think he does factor quite a bit in the decision for keeping Dee Alford. We saw Billy Bowman be very limited by injuries this past season, right? Dealing with some soft tissue issues earlier in the season and then having a season-ending Achilles tear in that Week 11 game against Carolina. And Bowman ultimately only played 6 games as the Falcons starting nickel, with Alford basically filling in the remaining 11 games. And frankly, based off of my charting of the defense, Alford was better, right? Yeah, looking at just the games where Alford was primarily a nickel cornerback in those 11 games and comparing it to Billy Bowman in sort of 3 key metrics that I chart when I'm breaking down the defense. I look at success rate, I look at forced incompletion rate, and I look at explosive plays allowed, right? And Alford was better in terms of a lower success rate allowed, which was 43% for Alford, 47% for Billy Bowman, right? So that's an improvement there. So offenses were less successful throwing the ball against Dee Alford as a primary man in coverage than they were throwing against Billy Bowman, right? Alford also forced more incompletions. Now, primarily forced incompletions are pass breakups, but also occasionally it will be really tight coverage, even if the defender did not get his hand on the ball, preventing a catch. And Alford had a forced incompletion rate of 11% versus Billy Bowman's 7%. So again, better for Alford there. And then you look at explosive plays allowed rate, right? Alford was 7% of his targets went for explosive plays. Billy Bowman was 10%. So again, opposing offenses had a little bit more success generating those explosive plays against Billy Bowman than they did Dee Alford. And with Bowman coming off that Achilles tear, it doesn't mean that he won't play in 2026, but it's very likely that, as we know, going through the Kirk Cousins experience, in 2024, you're not going to be coming off that injury better in that subsequent year, right? So in 2026, Billy Bowman's probably going to look worse than what he did last year. And he probably won't be able to build off of what he did last year, even in 6 limited games, until 2027, the following upcoming season. And so that basically means if you want to maintain or get better at the nickel cornerback spot, you need a stopgap. And, is there a better option for the Falcons as we sit here today than Dee Alford? Now, maybe the answer to that is yes, and we'll talk about that later when we talk about the decision to pass on Dee Alford. But Alford's coming off arguably his best year. Now, based off of my charting, he had better numbers in those metrics that we talked about in 2022. But I think some of that is owed to, him only basically splitting the snaps with Isaiah Oliver. When you compare his 23 and 25 seasons, those were really good. We obviously know the 24 season was a terrible season, but we're not going to hold that against Dee Alford because it was a down year for pretty much everybody on the defense except for, of course, oddly enough, J.D. Bertrand. And we don't like to be reductive on this podcast, but it will be just easier for all of us to just blame all the 2024 issues for any player on Jimmy Lake. And so 25, Alford was slightly better in some of those metrics than he was in 23. But to me, the thing that's notable about those 2 seasons in particular, less in the case of 2022, is that 23 and 25 were the seasons where the Falcons were the most man-heavy defense that they have been, right? Especially in 2023. And we talked about this before when we broke down the corners earlier this month, but the Falcons did kind of back off on their man coverage uses after like week 7 or so. But we talked about then how it's very likely that the Falcons, and a lot will depend potentially on the upgrades that they potentially make at the outside cornerback spot, would like to move back in that direction of being much more of a man heavy scheme, because that's really what Jeff Ulbricht's defense really specialized in New York. And I remember last offseason when talking about the idea of potentially bringing back Dee Alford despite his disastrous 2024 season, which again, we're blaming on Jimmy Lake. We talked about the potential for him to have a bounce back year in 2025 due to the likely increase of man coverage and due to the fact that, that 23 season, he was pretty good, right? And I think the other reason why bringing back Alford makes sense is he's probably not going to be that expensive. When you look at nickel corners, the premium on those guys is not as high as it is for outside corners. Typically, the highest paid nickel corners in the NFL are making anywhere between $10 and $12 million a year. I highly doubt Dee Alford's going to get that type of market. Instead, he's going to probably get more of that mid-tier nickel cornerback market, which is $3 to $7 million a year. And probably I expect him to be on the lower end of that, because last year when Dee Alford wasn't tendered as a restricted free agent, which allowed him to be an unrestricted free agent and basically be able to test his market for ultimately 3.5 weeks before he ultimately decided to re-sign with the Falcons for little more than a veteran minimum. The fact that he basically accepted little more than the veteran minimum told you that he had zero market elsewhere. He had no options better than basically playing for the veteran minimum here in Atlanta. And I don't think that's going to suddenly change in 2026, right? Now, maybe I'm wrong, but I figure, $3 million is probably all it's going to take to get Dee Alford locked up to a new deal. It might even not be that much, right? You might be able to get him on like a 2-year, $2.5 million deal. And you ask why sign him to a 2-year deal rather than a 1-year deal, right? Because just in case, we talk about Billy Bowman not being 100% until 2027 coming off that Achilles. But when he is 100% in 2027, is Billy Bowman going to be the nickel cornerback? Or is there a possibility, given that Jesse Bates is not technically under contract as we sit here today for the 2027 season, that the Falcons think about maybe moving Billy Bowman to safety instead of putting him at nickel corner? We'll see. Again, that remains to be seen. I think that's a possibility. And so I think, to be on the safe side, locking up Dee Alford through the 2027 season, I think would be a smart call, especially if you don't have to spend a lot of money to do so. But that's the case for keeping Dee Alford. That's the case to pay Dee Alford, because he's maybe the best nickel cornerback on your roster. But the case against him, the case for passing on Dee Alford, is just because he's the best nickel cornerback on your roster today doesn't mean you can't get better options tomorrow. And we'll break that down as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So the pressure is high in the NFL. And the pressure is high in your workplace. You got deadlines, overflowing inboxes, and that one position you have to fill sitting wide open, just like a wide receiver being covered by a Jimmy Lake defense. When the pressure is on, you need the right hire. Indeed is all you need. Indeed Sponsored Jobs helps you reach the right people who actually fit what you're looking for with skills, experience, and location, so that you're not just hoping the right candidate stumbles across your posts. Over the next minute that I'm talking to you, companies like yours will have made 27 hires on Indeed, according to Indeed data worldwide. So if you're hiring, spend less time searching and more time interviewing candidates who check all your boxes with Indeed Sponsored Jobs. Get a $75 sponsored job credit to help give your job that premium placement it deserves at Indeed.com/podcast. Just go to Indeed.com/podcast right now and support the show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs.
Hey, it's Matt Derry from the Locked On Lions podcast. The people I love depend on me. If I'm gone, the financial responsibilities don't disappear. I didn't want my family figuring things out during the hardest moment of their lives. That's why I knew only one place to go. I chose life insurance through my friends at Ethos. Ethos makes getting life insurance fast and easy, 100% online. You can get a quote in seconds, apply in minutes, and get same-day coverage. There's no medical exam. You just answer a few simple health questions. You can get up to $3 million in coverage. Some policies are as low as $30 a month. I love the folks at Ethos. Protect your family with life insurance from Ethos now by going to ethos.com/LockedOnNFL. In as little as 10 minutes, you can get the free quote and up to $3 million in coverage at ethos.com/LockedOnNFL. Locked On NFL. That is ethos.com/LockedOnNFL. Ethos.com/LockedOnNFL. Application times and rates may vary.
Yes, the combine is coming up, so you know it's draft season, but we're not talking about NFL draft prospects. We're talking about the 5-Hour Energy Flavor Draft, breaking down those tasty flavors, which is the best and which just might be those sleepers. The board is set, the flavors are ready, and only one is going to take that number one spot. 5-Hour Energy has a wide variety of flavors, something for everyone. I used to stroll into the gas station on the morning on my way to my old day job, and I would grab a 5-Hour Energy. And back then, it was basically just the berry and grape flavors, classics, but they've leveled up since. 17 flavors. Love the peach mango with that top spot, sweet tropical flavor that's just going to take me away. And I definitely want to try the confetti craze flavor because it's got that sweet birthday cake inspired flavor with buttery, freshly baked confetti cake, vanilla frosting, that sprinkle of sweetness in every sip. Who's going to be number one on your board? All you got to do is head on over to 5hourenergy.com or Amazon and find your new flavor of 5-Hour Energy shots, available again online at 5hourenergy.com or Amazon. So the case to pass on Dee Alford, to let him go, is pretty simple. As solid as Alford was in 2025, the Falcons can do better in 2026. And again, we're not basing that off of, poor performance in 2024. We're basing that on the idea that, even though he's mostly good in a man forward scheme like we've seen in 25 and 23, you can find a guy that's just as good in man coverage, if not better, and also good in zone, right? So it doesn't really matter what scheme you run. You have a guy that can do it all, right? And we know that the nickel cornerback position is such a critical part of run defense. There's a lot of room for upgrade with Dee Alford there, right? His missed tackle rate, according to PFF, was in the 40th percentile among cornerbacks last year. That basically means he's a below average tackler by NFL standards. And that's really just looking at all his missed tackles, which includes coverage. If you just look at his missed tackles in run downs, his missed tackle rate would have been 13th percentile. So one of the worst tacklers in the NFL, at least when it comes to stopping the run this past season. And I don't like to be that guy that's just simply going to basically, hey, the Super Bowl champions did this, and so everybody should do this. I don't like doing that. But at the same time, this is the beginning of my apology tour for being so wrong about Nicky Manwari last year. As you guys remember me basically saying, I don't really get this guy, mostly because I was looking at him as purely as a safety, and the Seahawks in their infinite wisdom, and this is why they get paid the big bucks, we're like, you know what? Aaron, you're onto something. We don't like him as a safety. We like him as a nickel cornerback. And you saw how beneficial that was to having a big nickel like that really helped them out physically and matching up all year long, all the way to the Super Bowl. And that's the type of cornerback that's in vogue. It's basically why we use that as an example. Getting bigger at that position makes sense, right? That's in vogue. And it makes sense for the Falcons because, hey, they just got another big wide receiver in the division. After spending 12 years dealing with Mike Evans, now they got to spend potentially another 12 dealing with Tetairoa McMillon. And we saw Carolina do a very effective job of utilizing Tetairoa McMillon in the slot this past year against the Falcons. Now, in that first game, Dee Alford was primarily playing outside because A.J. Terrell was injured. But at the second game, it was a lot of Dee Alford up against Tetairoa McMillon. And you look at Tetairoa McMillon's yards per route run, according to Pro Football Focus, against the Falcons from the slot. In those two games combined, it was 4.9. Against every other team this year, it was 1.4. So he was 3.5 times more effective in the slot against the Falcons than he was against any other team in the NFL. And for the record, that 4.9 record would be the 4.9 yards per route run would be incredible, right? Puka Nacua was the best slot receiver in the NFL based off of that metric with a 3.5 yards per route run. And then Drake London was number 5, by the way, at 2.8, right? So Tetairoa McMillon was basically the greatest slot receiver in the history of sports in the two games against the Falcons, basically. And we talk a lot about, we need to get that outside corner that can match up against a big receiver like Tetairoa McMillon and the Mike Evanses and all those guys, whatnot. But you know what happens? Let's say the Falcons successfully accomplish that mission and they get that big outside corner. You know what the Carolina Panthers or any smart team is going to do? It's like, oh, we'll just move him to the slot. And now we can feast on your small shrimp corners all day long like we did last year. Right. And so basically the case against keeping Dee Alford is the Falcons can do better. They can get a guy that has more size, more physicality, that can do better in run defense, that can match up better in man coverage, that can match up better in zone. So there's lots of room for improvement at this nickel cornerback position. Now, the challenge with that is what type of investment do you need to do in order to improve? You're going to need to spend more than $2 or $3 million a year in free agency. Are you going to need to use a day 2 pick on that type of cornerback that's going to solidify that spot at the nickel spot, right? We know that there's not a huge premium on nickel corners, right? Typically, those guys aren't typically the guys that are going in the top 50. So you got a good chance that you could potentially get the best nickel cornerback in this draft class at pick 48, the Falcons' first pick in this year's draft, right? But if you're going to get a guy that checks all these boxes that we're talking about, that is basically the complete perfect nickel cornerback, that guy's usually going to go either in round 2, late round 2, or in, round 3. So if you don't get that guy at 48 and you don't get that guy at 79, which is the Falcons' 3rd round pick, chances are if you wait to the 4th round, you're probably not getting a guy that's really that going to check all those boxes and be that significant an upgrade over what you already have in potentially Dee Alford and Billy Bowman. And so maybe this year's draft class is deeper than that, but based off of what I saw at the Senior Bowl, like it looks like a pretty typical nickel cornerback class to me, at least. But we'll see how that take ages. Hopefully, it ages better than my Nicky Emanwari takes. By the time we get to the draft. But I think that's really the case against keeping Dee Alford. And so ultimately, I just think when you think about the likelihood of a low price, the likelihood of a competent level of play, and the amount of investment that the Falcons would have to do to upgrade that spot, coupled with not being able to rely entirely on Billy Bowman to bounce back coming off an Achilles tear in 2026, all signs seem to point it makes the most sense for the Falcons to give Dee Alford that 1 or 2 year contract, lock him in. And if you come across another guy that is better than Dee Alford or Billy Bowman bounce backs and takes that spot back, then Dee Alford's gonna be making what, $2-3 million. That's not terrible to pay a backup, especially one that can be functional as a plug and play starter if need be. So to me, all signs seem to point that Alford will be back in 2026, but we'll see. I always would love to hear you guys weigh in. And certainly if you can make an argument against keeping Dee Alford that doesn't involve talking about the disaster that was Jimmy Lake's defense in 2024, then I'm all ears. But if it's just basically like he's terrible, and it's like, why do you think that? Oh, because he was terrible in 2024. And it's like, all right, but okay, is that all you got? But we'll see. So always welcome your feedback on that. Would you pass or would you pay Dee Alford? But we'll probably skip guys like Kyle Pitts, Caden Ellis, and Arnold Bicchetti, at least for the time being, when we do our next couple of these, and get into some guys, just because we've talked about those guys already. And so if we're going to talk about them again on one of these episodes, I want to do it at a later time when maybe we have more information to consider than having the debates that we've already had with those 3 guys. And so maybe our next one will probably be Leonard Floyd, who's a player that we haven't spent that much time talking about. And so we'll get to some more of these Falcons free agents that are impending, and this pass or pay that we're going to go with now, because we love the alliteration. And our next episode should be whatever we get into, whatever shenanigans Jarvis Davis and I get into on tomorrow's episode. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. Make sure you check out Locked On NFL as your second listen. And then, of course, check out the Everydayer Club, right? There's no off season for the Everydayers. Get, an ad-free version of Locked On Falcons, premium Locked On Discord access, and so much more at the link in the description below, lockedonfalcons.supercast.com for all those perks. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.